This week, you're going to start to really think about different fonts. Your exercise this week is called Design a Word, and you're going to each be given a word, and you're going to have to think about the word's meaning, and then design the word to communicate that meaning. So look at the assignment for more clarity, and there's also some more information in the next video lecture. But what's important is that you understand that type is very significant and that you have to carefully consider all of your decisions before you apply type to the design. There's different fonts that can be used, and it's really important that you start to explore and look at all these different types of fonts and that you think about what the characters mean and how they provide meaning in the design. So let's start out with families. We've kind of divided fonts into different families. This particular family is called Old Style, and it includes Palatino, Times, Bakersville, Gaudi. And Old Style, if you notice with the O, has a very diagonal stress. And on the L here, you'll notice that these are very pronounced serifs on the lowercase letters. There's very moderate, thick, thin transitions in the strokes, and that's kind of a style that you can see repeated in some of these particular fonts: the diagonal stress, the pronounced serif in the lowercase letter, and the moderate, thick, thin transition. And these old style fonts were Roman style, introduced in the late 15th century, and they almost sort of mimic the hand lettering of the scribes. They're actually very legible because those thick, thin transitions aren't too pronounced. It's easy to read these fonts, so they're actually pretty good for a lot of type or a lot of text in a design. And so it's recommended that you look at these if you have some paragraphs you have to include, or you want to get a certain feeling. These might be the perfect solution. Modern fonts are serifs or type families that were introduced in the 18th century and early 19th century. And they're kind of mimicking sort of the mechanical inventions that were occurring at that time. Most of them, Bodini, Times Bold, Ultra, Walbaum, have cold, almost elegant, striking appearances. They have very strong vertical stresses, very extreme thick thin transitions. So look at this O here. You have the tiny line and then the real thick line. The serifs on the lowercase letters are thin and horizontal, and because of those extreme thick thin transition, these types of fonts are not very good for lots of copy. So if you have like a couple of paragraphs of text and you try and use one of these fonts, it might be really hard for people to read because of the extreme thick thin transitions. So consider it for small amounts of type in your design, but not for extensive type because of the legibility factor. Then we have slab serif. Slab serif fonts have serifs, these pronounced little boots on the lowercase letters. They're horizontal and thick. There's very little or no thick thin transition or contrast in the strokes. And there's often, if there is a little thick thin transition, a very vertical stress. So some fonts include Memphis, Memphis Extra Bold, New Century Schoolbook, Clarendon. And these slab serif fonts were invented in the early 19th century. And they are pretty good for extensive text because they have such minimal thick thin transitions. Usually you see these types of fonts in children's books, for example. Pretty legible, so an option if you have copy that you need to include. Then you have sans serif fonts. So Helvetica is an example of a sans serif font. These were invented in the 20th century, and what makes them, all a family is there are no serifs anywhere. So sans serif fonts have no serifs, no stress because there's no thick thin transitions, very legible, and they often don't communicate a ton with their personality, but they can be used in a variety of situations. That's why, for example, Helvetica is such a versatile font. So often if you need copy to be very straightforward, very clean, and not overly distracting, you might want to pick a sans serif font. Then you have these sort of, we'll call them carpe diem, very ornate, decorative, script-based fonts, and they kind of resemble handwriting or the drawing of fonts with a calligraphic pen. So they're really beautiful. They can be very significant in what they communicate. And the advice would be to use them very sparingly, because if you imagine like a whole paragraph in one of these fonts, it's almost impossible to distinguish and read what it's saying. So maybe one or two words, a sentence, but nothing more than that. And definitely don't use all caps, because if you use all caps, these become completely illegible. And then, of course, you have just fonts that don't fall into any distinct category. They're trendy, decorative, unique characteristics, and they're invented all the time by different designers for specific purposes. And as we kind of go through the course, we'll watch some videos. One of the videos you'll watch is on Margot Chase. And you'll notice that she invents a font every time she gets a big client and does an identity design for them. So often designers will create their own font for every big client they get, because then that client owns the font, can use it for whatever they want, and it sort of marks them and identifies them. So I would recommend really, being creative. You can hand draw out letters, scan them in, and use them in Illustrator for your designs. You can vectorize them and then kind of tweak them and make them yours. So often designers do that, starting out with sort of hand-drawn versions, going digital, tweaking, and then creating a whole font family. So thinking about text, we've been talking about the elements, and then we've been talking about principles. So text is applicable to all these things we're thinking about. When you design with scale, you can emphasize certain text in your design. And you always, when you design with text, want to think about that visual hierarchy, because it's very important. What text element needs to be legible and read first? What text elements don't necessarily need to be read? And then you kind of strategize. How do you make that happen within your design? Sometimes there's sort of a playfulness where you kind of make text almost part of the graphic. So in this example, you see that the 2 zeros in 100 are mimicking eyeglasses. So that can be kind of a clever thing you do, mimicking the graphic or adding to the graphic, and it has sort of a double meaning, which can be very clever. Sometimes you don't need legibility with type, or you can mix up a lot of different fonts depending on what you're designing, what you're trying to communicate. Often the rule is you don't want to use more than one font. Keep it really simple, keep it really consistent, but sometimes you can be really experimental. And we'll kind of learn this as we go, but there's lots of different techniques here. If you look at some of the Illustrator videos, this is called text on a path, where this line would have been drawn in Illustrator, and then the text just sort of is typed directly onto that path. So there's lots of cool things you can do in Illustrator with text layout, making it really function as part of the design. And the goal is to really think about type as integrated and communicating with the visual elements like imagery and illustrations. And how do you make the text more than just slapped on there as an afterthought? How do you make it interact and be part of that space? We will be learning later on about a designer named David Carson, and he was famous for his grunge typography, very textural, very unlegible to some extent. He didn't care so much about legibility. He was trying to communicate ideas with how he laid out his font, and he was very innovative and very interesting. So we'll learn more about him as we kind of go through the semester, but this is an example of his some of his typographic design for Ray Gun magazine. Kind of clever. I love this sort of elegant type in here, mimicking the branches of the tree. Another one where the text is kind of mimicking the music. And this might be, this is kind of similar to David Carson's style, where it's very grunge-based up here, headbanger, mimicking the sort of violent action that these two guys down here are engaged in. But then you have this look at this paragraph here, very precise, laid out on a grid, very aligned, and that kind of creates this contrast with the more grunge-based style, the sort of grittiness of the graphics, and makes it look interesting because you have these two contrasting factors, a text that's very organized, arranged, specific, and then a more sort of gritty grunge style. It's a clever campaign for, you know, reducing homogenized products. King Lear. So what's happening here with our text design? So you can see that this is probably like a hand-drawn font, or maybe even they used a paintbrush to create it, and then they digitized it, and then they vectorized it, or perhaps they did it digitally. So there's different ways you would do this, but very hand-drawn, very gestural, as if the designer really wants to get that intent across. It's not typed in, it's not very precise, and it has that sort of organic feel. And then color can be really important. The color you choose to apply to your text is significant because, for example, this red color is really matching what's happening down here and balancing this design. And then William Shakespeare, because of this contrast, this white text on this black background, creates a nice contrast that makes it very visible, and it has its own sort of emphasis. Just kind of an interesting way. This is called ghosting, where you take a rectangular shape and you put text within it, and sometimes there's like a semi-transparent area underneath where you can still see what's going on in the image. Another example of ghosting with a specific shape, the cross-like shape, so that if we were to lay les blancs right on top of the graphic, it would really compete with it. But by ghosting it out in this shape and then seeing through the shape, it gives it more cohesive unity. Very clever. More examples of hand-drawn type used in a clever way to communicate the idea. And of course, not all this text is meant to be legible. So there's certain parts of it that you see, that you read, and other parts that are just sort of part of the space, part of the image, part of the design, not necessarily there to be read. Clever use of negative space really gets the point across. A fun design. And this was done for a design firm that was really thinking innovatively about placing type within the space and with the graphics, and really making the type part of the graphic. So type and visual, this cooperative action is occurring in the design, and it's creating tension between the type and visual. Okay, another nice example of type being used in conjunction with a visual in a very cohesive way. So you have type and visual, and then literally type as a visual, where type becomes the visual and it's actually what's being communicated in the space. Kind of a fun layering technique used here, but even though there's a lot going on, I feel like it's not too chaotic. You're really able to engage in it and look at it. And you can also learn in Illustrator how to put text in a shape, and that's called text in a path. And this is not exactly an example of that, but something that might be applied where you're putting text within a specific area. Well, I love the sort of visual flow of this and how these letters just seem to be spinning through this space, and how cleverly it was done down here, where you can actually read some of the information, but it just feels like these letters are sort of flowing throughout the space and then kind of going down to the bottom. Okay, nice example of kind of text, image, there's contrast, there's overlap, but where the image and the text is overlapping, the image becomes, or the text becomes more transparent. Where the text is overlapping, the image kind of disappears. So really cleverly put together. This is a great example of contrast, this happy couple, and then this really dark, strong word that makes you think. Okay, so sometimes you just use these letter shapes. Sometimes the letter shapes are part of the space, and all you have is typography, and it becomes a typographic design. A great, significant graphic used to talk about hunger in the Sudan. Now this image is a good example of maybe going overboard. This was for a theater poster, and I feel like there's a little bit too much chaos, a little bit too much energy. It's hard for me to look at it for very long. So if I were the designer of this one, I would pull back a little and give the graphics and the text a little bit more room. Another same poster series from that design firm that was really thinking about text strategically with their graphics. And I just, there's a lot of intent here. Nothing's on a grid in this design, but there's a really nice visual flow. This was a snowboard company, and you can see how clever it is with the type becoming part of the snowflake there. Hand-drawn, really cool hand-drawn lettering applied to the graphic and becoming part of the graphic. Okay, another example of text and image, and text used sort of in a grid-like way. I like how some of these images are very almost gestural. Some are photographic, and then you have the type in there, and you can combine all three elements really effectively. Okay, so another example of transparency, sort of overlapping, but doing in a strategic way where things don't feel too much like they're competing. Like you can still read the text elements and still sort of decipher the image, and the design overall is feeling right. Okay, text being used in collaboration with the graphic. There's a message there. What is the text communicating? The same in this design. What is the text doing, and how is it interacting with the graphic, and what interesting sort of action is occurring? And this is all type, but a fun design. Sometimes, there's a fun exercise we do in the illustration class where we create an image just using text, and that's kind of a good exercise to do. It's very clever, and you can kind of build these really interesting ideas just using type as shape and as part of the graphic. And as we kind of go forward, we talked a little bit about this, but we're going to learn more about the grid system and how when you design with type, it's almost always critical that you have a grid in place so that you can do the layout and the arrangement really seamlessly, especially when you're dealing with large blocks of text, because it's almost impossible to lay out large blocks of text without a grid in place to align to the page. Just like a fun idea. Sometimes you can do this really fun thing where you take one letter in the word, and this might be really something you consider for your design a word project. You take one letter and you sort of have this fun, energetic idea, and you apply it to that specific letter, and then you just let the rest of the words be as they are. So try that. Sometimes that can communicate the idea beautifully when you're designing a logo or when you have some content to be included, but you don't want to overwhelm the design. Just kind of text can be created from anything. So be open-minded, creative, think about different solutions, sometimes hand drawing, sometimes using fonts that are, on places like dafont.com that you can download, but really consider it. What is the best type? Do you want to create it yourself? Do you want to hand draw it? Is there something out there that's perfect? So really explore and try and find the best solution. Okay, kind of a fun just example of text being used in sort of a way where it becomes the graphic itself. And Bic did this really clever campaign where they wanted to communicate that energy of the fire of the product, and they did a really nice job creating this simple design that communicated that.